Okay, hello YouTube. If you don't know, recently in chess news, Ian Nepomniachtchi and Daniil Dubov got double forfeited because they shuffled their knights around, and then they just agreed to a draw after shuffling their knights around and putting them back in the starting positions, and then agreeing to a draw. And this got me thinking, what happens in those situations where we're in the last round of a tournament, we have the white pieces, and we need to get a draw. All we need is a draw in order to win first place. Or maybe we have the black pieces, and we absolutely have to win with black in order to get first place. Like, what openings should we play? What gives us the best chances to do this? Well, anyways, if you like content like this and you want to hear more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So, the conclusion I came to is we should open up with pawn to e4. Like, if we need to draw with white, paradoxically, e4 is going to be the best move to try to do it. Well, why is that? Well, most opening repertoires kind of revolve around equalizing with black and trying to get an advantage with white. And because of this, black is going to be playing a lot of lines where he's okay with equalizing, and some of those lines might have perpetuals in them. And you can just get a perpetual really easily. And usually, in order to avoid the perpetual, they have to give you some sort of advantage. So one example is this so-called Berlin draw that happens after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. If all they have in their repertoire is the Berlin defense with the black pieces, you can force a draw pretty easily. You can play castles kingside, knight takes e4, d4, knight to d6, takes on e5. This is the line that forces the draw. Of course, here white can play for a win, starting with bishop takes d6, but d takes e5 forces this so-called Berlin draw. It goes knight to b5, a4, knight d4, knight d4, knight d4, queen d4, d5 takes, queen takes, and then we have the queens shuffling back and forth with check, and everybody has to shake hands because that's three-move repetition. And honestly, if they have the Berlin in their repertoire, and white decides to go for this Berlin draw after you've played knight f6, it's really hard to avoid it without having some sort of disadvantage with the black pieces. Now, another advantage to playing e4 is there's stuff like this in other openings, like even within the Ruy Lopez. If they say, aha, after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, I play the Ruy Lopez. Well, I'm not going to play the Berlin because I know you want to draw, so I'm going to threaten to play something else. I'm going to play the other aggressive line that everybody likes to play, which is the Marshal. They can play a6, and then bishop a4, and then knight f6, and they can try to play this Marshal. Bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, castles kingside threatens to play the Marshal. Well, you can just let them. Because the Marshal, the reason people avoid it isn't because white's getting mated or anything. The reason people avoid it is because it's ending in these perpetual checks. So it's ending in perpetuals, and the perpetual goes after c3, d5 takes, knight takes, and then we take everything. Black whips up an attack, and he needs to get counterplay because he's down a pawn. And he ends up getting play on the light squares. We have to play queen d3 and cover the light squares. We have to threaten to play queen f1 to meet bishop f3 so we don't get mated. And then black starts whipping up a bigger attack. He's threatening rook e6, f5, etc. White tries to get some counterplay on the queen side, open up his a file. Black plays queen h5. After ab, if white wants to, white can basically force a draw with queen f1. Because we're threatening to play queen g2 and consolidate everything and just have a huge advantage. Because we still have an extra pawn. So black basically has to take the draw. He has to play bishop h3 and just kind of shuffle this queen around. You know, bishop h3 just perpetually attack the queen. And there's a lot of draws that end in perpetual by perpetually attacking the queen, just like there's draws that end in perpetual by perpetually attacking the king. So another draw that ends in perpetual would be in, say, the Pirc defense. We have e4, d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, g6, f4, bishop g7, knight f3, c5, we would have this bishop d5 check draw. This is a draw that was going around for a while. It goes bishop d7, and then we have e5, knight g4, e6, fe6, and of course there's plenty of deviations here, mostly for white. Knight to g5, and then we have bishop takes b5, and if white wants to, again, white can play for a win. White can play queen takes g4. But if white wants to, white can force the draw with knight takes e6, bishop d4, knight takes d8, and then perpetual check. So that's another forced draw. So a lot of people are like, okay, well, this is never going to happen. Like, if e4, e5, if they play, you know, why would they play symmetrical if they know that you need a draw? Like, I needed a draw in the last round one time against International Master. He played a6, and I played the exchange variation Ruy Lopez. And I played a line that involved exchanging queens. That's another way to try to go for a draw in chess, is just make the position as dead as possible. Make the position as symmetrical as possible and exchange as much stuff as possible and just try to make the end game a draw. But the lesson that you're going to learn there is when you do that, there's always the possibility that your opponent can try to grind the game out for as long as possible and just keep playing for a win. And of course, we know there's a lot of players that are very good at this, like players like Magnus Carlsen. So what happens if your opponent tries to avoid both? He tries to avoid all the perpetuals, and he tries to avoid even the symmetrical positions that could end in grinds. So a huge suggestion that you hear from people is, like, if you have to play for a win with black, or you just don't want white to be able to play for a draw, you should just play something like the Najdorf Sicilian, and you should try to get a draw that way. There's a lot of draws in the Najdorf Sicilian that white can force sometimes. Like after knight f3, d6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, a6, there was a draw in the World Championship match between Nigel Short and Garry Kasparov in the main line bishop g5 Najdorf Sicilian. After e6, f4, Garry plays the poison pawn, and here, basically, white ended up forcing the draw from this point, because at this point, all of black's moves were sort of best play. Nigel Short played queen d2, queen takes b2, rook b1, queen a3, f5, knight c6. We have this capture on e6, this capture on c6. We just have a developing move, castles, castles, and then after rook b3, attacking the queen plays check, and then white just perpetuals the queen. He just keeps attacking the queen over and over again, and the queen is in perpetual and just has to keep moving around, and that's a draw. So we can perpetual the queen within the poison pawn. Now, of course, they don't have to play the poison pawn. They can play the main line. They can play this bishop e7 move instead of the poison pawn. There was a draw going around in the main line for the longest time. It was continuing bishop e7, queen f3, h6, bishop h4, g5, fg5, knight fd7, knight takes e6, f takes e6, queen h5, king f8, bishop b5. And there is actually a forced draw here eventually in one line. It's interesting to note, though, it's not clear that white should remotely take it. At least according to the engine, white can have a major advantage if he doesn't go for the draw. But the draw would involve something like rook h7 is apparently the only defensive move for black. And then the idea is we castle, we play g6, and we bring the rook to f7. Now what's interesting is we can force the draw outright by just exchanging on d7 first. So we could take on d7, knight takes d7, then castles, and then g6, and then apparently, according to the engine, we have nothing better than just going for this draw with queen h7, queen h8, queen h7. But the question remains, like, why would we make this exchange if the position is absolutely the same, strategically, tactically, with the bishop on b5, as opposed to without the bishop on b5? There's basically no difference. Why would we exchange our bishop? We could just keep the bishop, and that gives us this interesting additional option. So if we go back, after rook h7, we could castle kingside, king over, g6, rook f7, same line, we just go down it. And of course here, we can play queen h7, queen h8, we can take the draw if we want it. If we really want it with white, we can take the draw, but there's this other possibility. We can just bring the rook to f1, and then after, say, something like bishop f6, we would play e5, d takes e5, and we can keep our bishop. We can bring our bishop back to e2 and just keep attacking. And at least according to the engine, this is supposed to be decisive advantage white. So white should actually be winning in these lines. So a lot of times it's a choice between, do you take the advantage with white, or do you force a perpetual with white? So in the Open Sicilian, these options sort of abound. So that leaves the question, if you're playing black, what should you do with the black pieces if you absolutely have to play for a win with black? My suggestion for that, and it's a little paradoxical, is you should play something like the French defense. You should play something like e6. It's actually very difficult to get any kind of perpetual against e6. A perpetual isn't going to happen. Now, it is hard to avoid a symmetrical pawn structure. So like after d4 and then d5, if white says, hey, all I need is a draw, I'm going to go ahead and play the exchange variation. You can get a symmetrical pawn structure, but a symmetrical pawn structure does not mean that you're going to have a symmetrical position. And this is kind of this weird option that black has, is since he's moving second, whatever setup white chooses, black can choose an asymmetrical setup. And this was actually a favorite thing that Alexander Alekhine did. Alexander Alekhine would almost always play for a win with black from these positions. And the way you do it is, like, let's say they play knight f3. Well, if they play knight f3, then you take a setup involving bishop d6, bishop d3, knight c6, and you force them to play pawn to c3. And then you put your other knight on e7. So now you've got your knights on e7 and c6, but they're going to have their knights on f3 and d2. So his idea was basically after castles, he wants to play bishop g4, he wants to play queen d7, and then he wants to castle queenside and just attack on the queen side. You're castled on opposite wings. Now what's interesting is his idea also was after e takes d5, well, what if they play bishop d3? Well, you do the same thing. You play knight c6. You play the other setup. You play knight c6, knight e2, and then let's say bishop d6, c3. You let them do this. And what's really interesting is because you haven't moved your knight yet, you have this additional option with black. You don't have to just play knight e7. What he would play here is something like queen h4. And he actually had this really interesting game. It was Winter versus Alexander Alekhine played in 1936, which he won. It continued knight d2, bishop g4. We had queen c2, and then of course castles queenside, because why wouldn't you, right? You're gonna castle queenside and just get this ridiculously aggressive position against white. And this is by no means a dead equal symmetrical pawn structure position. This is a dynamic attacking position for black, so you have to win with the black pieces. This is definitely the way to go. So that's my recommendation. Like, if you have to win with the black pieces, avoid playing, of course, e4, e5, but I would also recommend against e4, c5. There's too many lines in the bishop g5 lines of, like, say, the Najdorf, for example, that end in a draw. There's too many lines even in the Dragon where white can play some sort of novelty and possibly just get a draw. So I would say play something like e6, allow the exchange French, because maybe they want to play for a draw with getting the exchange French, and then just play asymmetrically. Whatever setup they choose the other setup, play asymmetrically, and then just play for a win. This might be the best way to try to play for a win with the black pieces, is do something like the French defense. It might be the best way to try to play for a win, is to play kind of this, sort of passive French setup and play for a win. So anyways, that's my advice. If you absolutely had to draw in the last round with white, or you absolutely have to win in the last round with black, I think those are sort of the opening choices you need to make. And also, if both players want to draw in the last round, I guess either, play e4, e5 and go for a Marshall, a Berlin, or a Perk. And then just get the forced perpetual. So anyways, I hope you liked content like this. Hope you want to see more of it. Please hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, click on your notification icon. I hope you enjoyed the content. I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.